Hi, everyone. I'm Donna Anderson, author of lovefraud.com and host of the True Love Fraud Stories podcast. Today, I'm speaking with my good friend, Dr. Liane Leedom. Dr. Leedom is a psychiatrist, a professor of counseling and psychology at the University of Bridgeport, and an expert on the impact of psychopathy on the family members of affected individuals. I've asked Dr. Leedom to listen to and then comment on our most recent episodes of True Love Fraud Stories, a 3-part series called Love and Losing My Mind. This is the story of a young woman whom I call Susanna and her 2.5-year relationship with a man whom I call Luke. He turned out to be an abuser and probably a psychopath. This interview has 3 parts. First, Dr. Leedom will talk about how the stress of Susanna's relationship affected her brain. Part 2 is an explanation of the 4 behavioral systems, including the affiliation system, that enable us to have relationships with other people. And in Part 3, Dr. Leedom offers advice on recovery from an abusive relationship. Here's part 1 of my conversation with Dr. Leedom. In this story, Susanna and Luke would go on short trips and have a great time. But then when they returned home, Luke would give her the silent treatment. So why is the silent treatment so painful for people?
I'll answer that question, but I feel like there's so much background required to provide an answer. So I'll provide an answer, and then you can decide if you want the background to the answer.
Okay.
People expect validation from their love relationships. And so what validation, it occurs on a lot of levels. And I think validation or invalidation is a theme of this story. That people need validation. The first level need is kind of a strong word. Validation is healthy. First of all, validating your reality, so your reality as it is. We went on this vacation. We had a great time. And then validating your emotional reality and your shared emotional reality. And then validating your worth as a person and your qualities as a person. And it is not wrong or abnormal to require validation from the people that you love. And so that was another thing for me listening to this woman, that everything she reports is entirely within normal limits. So if anyone listening to her thought that she maybe went into this with issues, I don't think her issues were any greater than anyone else's. I think they were within the normative range of developmental issues that a person in their 20s has, in their late 20s, which she has. So the reason why silence is hurtful is that it's so invalidating.
What was the effect of Luke's alternating good and bad treatment on Susanna?
Okay, so I'm really glad you asked that question, because that gets to the heart of what I was saying about the affiliation system. So remember, the affiliation system is there to provide us with protection and relief from fear. So the script of the system is, I feel afraid, and then I go to the people that I'm in relationship with, and they provide me protection, and I get relief from my fear. So in this situation, it's common for people to run to the perpetrator for protection and relief from the fear. And I'm just remembering too that everybody has heard of Stockholm syndrome. And that's the same thing where victims of a kidnapping or a crime actually will run to the perpetrator for protection. It's just somehow hardwired into our DNA. that we do that. So the alternating good-bad treatment is what creates what we call a trauma bond. And that is true not just for humans, but it's true for dogs. It's true for all primates. In fact, this is a strategy, by the way, all primate males, gorilla males do this to the gorilla females, and the researchers have found that the bad treatment actually makes the females run to the male gorilla all the more. Happens in baboons as well. So humans, we're not alone, and it's just part of our biology.
How does extreme relationship stress, like Susanna experienced, alter or affect the physiology and chemistry in the brain?
Well, when I was listening to her story, Donna, I think most of the listeners know that, or maybe have heard that in the past I was a victim as well. And I remember the day that the extent of my victimization became known to me, I had those same GI symptoms. And me being a doctor, I actually wondered if he had been poisoning me with opiates without my knowledge, because what I experienced felt like opiate withdrawal. And I've always had that in the back of my mind, that why would it be that that stress would feel like opiate withdrawal to me? Well, maybe some of your listeners who are also victims can relate to her story. She said she had a stomach virus, but her symptoms also sounded like opiate withdrawal. And she even said, I've been through opiate withdrawal and this was worse. And so I think that these symptoms that she had at the end was indeed a form of opiate withdrawal. In that as social bonds form, that attachment bond, the sexual bond form with this person, then that part of that bond involved changes in the opiate system of the brain, which your listeners might know of as the endorphin system of the brain. So then when those endorphins are no longer available, then you have withdrawal and vomiting, nausea, and skin crawling, like she described, all the symptoms of opiate withdrawal. We know also that trauma produces changes in other hormones that are present in the brain and circulate throughout the body. But I don't want the listeners to think that this is well worked out and science knows all this for sure, because we really don't. In fact, one interesting thing is that when they study people who are falling in love in the context of a good relationship, they show all those stress hormone levels going up as well. So it's not just hormones going up and down and neurochemistry changing that's the important thing, but it's the context of it as well, that these changes in brain chemistry and in hormones are occurring in the context of something that the brain or that the person is interpreting as really horrible.
Susanna couldn't understand Luke's behavior, which went from loving to totally rejecting, and which she said led to cognitive dissonance. So what is cognitive dissonance?
All right. Well, you had mentioned this to me a number of weeks ago, and at the time I thought, well, I wasn't so sure. But now I believe that she's using that term correctly, having listened to her story. So what cognitive dissonance is that, so say you're, nowadays we don't have salespeople coming to the door, but so say you went and you bought a car and a used car, and somebody did a real good sales job on you. Oh, this is the best car in the world. And so you're telling yourself, oh, I just got the deal of the decade. And this is great. I love this car. And, you're looking and you're just loving everything about it. And so suddenly, because you've made a choice, your thinking changes and you focus on all the positive aspects of that choice while disregarding the negative aspects. And then as time goes on and the car starts breaking down and you're having all these problems with it, you're still saying this is the greatest car in the world, and your mind can't wrap itself around the fact that things aren't as great as you initially thought they were. So that's cognitive dissonance. That's rejecting facts that indicate that you maybe made an unwise choice. So in that case, I think that the overall pattern shows that that's why she had a hard time. If it weren't for cognitive dissonance, anyone without cognitive dissonance could listen to the facts of her relationship and say, this person is no good. But because of what she called cognitive dissonance, she wasn't capable of doing that at the time because she was invested in maintaining a view of him as being a quote unquote good person.
Okay. So Susanna said that because of her relationship with Luke, she was losing her executive functioning. So what is executive functioning?
Okay. So executive functioning is part of a set of abilities that make up what psychologists call self-regulation. The self-regulation involves executive function, which is how you control your attention, how you organize your time, how you plan ahead, how you make decisions. And also, relatedly, those things impact your emotion regulation capacity. So executive attention, the other executive function tasks, and emotion regulation all make up what psychologists call self-regulation. So she is saying that this relationship impacted her self-regulation skills. And so, because she might use the word executive function, but I'm not now just speaking of her, I'm speaking about most people that end up, with this kind of victimization. The fear, she may not have been aware of it, but the good-bad treatment was producing a near constant state of fear in her. And it's that constant state of fear that interferes with what was called executive attention, which other people could call mindfulness. And so if you're not mindful and you're not paying attention to what's going on, you don't remember things, because you don't remember things you don't pay attention to. And you lose the ability to organize yourself and carry out multi-step tasks, right? And also, as you become more emotionally dysregulated, it's not just fear that you have a problem with, but it's other negative emotions.
So then how does stress affect the executive functioning?
Well, so executive functioning, all those tasks, paying attention, organizing yourself, planning, making decisions, those are all cognitive functions, things that your higher brain or neocortex does. Now, you also have an emotional brain. So we have kind of our higher thinking brain sits right on top of our emotional brain. And when the emotional brain is in overdrive, then that impairs the function of the thinking brain. And in dialectical behavioral therapy, we call that emotion mind, that the person is a setup for dysregulation, because instead of their thinking brain functioning properly and helping them, navigate life, they're in emotion mind and they're just making decisions and functioning purely off of their emotions.
So would that be related to the incident where she described she was at a table and could not remember how to draw the number 5?
Right, that her thinking brain was not working because the emotional dysregulation was so strong.
And she also said that she was having suicidal ideation. So what would have led to that?
Well, people feel suicidal. People have suicidal thoughts. The usual cause is that they see suicide as being a possible solution to their problem, right? That's usually the cause of being suicidal, is you have a set of problems that you don't feel that you have a good solution for, but suicide is a solution. So that's a sign that even though parts of her weren't fully aware of it, that she was feeling very boxed in and backed up against the corner without a way out, without other solutions. And so in that context, suicidal thinking is common.
Okay, so are there any other ways that trauma affects the brain that we didn't talk about?
Oh, yeah. So there is a set of symptoms. I'm going to use a word that has a bunch of different definitions, but probably the listeners have heard it. It's called dissociation. So dissociation has a bunch of different definitions. And so I'm just going to talk about one set of dissociative symptoms, and that is symptoms related to sensory perception. So trauma can change the way things look. Trauma can change sounds, the way people process sounds. Trauma can change how people process smells, any kind of sensory input. And the other thing trauma really does is impact time perception. And also, trauma impacts our perceptions of ourselves. So someone who's undergoing this kind of extreme relationship stress, everything can feel unreal to them. They could feel like they're leaving their body. They could feel disconnected from their body. They could look at their hand and they could say, gosh, that doesn't look like it's my hand. So trauma will impact all of our senses in this way. And the global term for that is dissociation.
Susanna was traumatized and then learned that Luke had lied, cheated, and betrayed her. And then one of the last nights with Luke, she got hot, nauseous, and passed out. Did we discuss this already, or what would have caused that?
Oh, so that's, again, I'm thinking that she's having these kind of withdrawal symptoms related to her, whatever's going on in her brain. And then, you might also hear the term vasovagal episode. So sometimes extreme stress can cause the vagus nerve to discharge, and that can cause fainting in people. So I think a medical person hearing that story might say, well, she could have had a vasovagal episode.
Okay, so Susanna came to believe that she was under the influence of mind control. So what are the signs of mind control, and how is the target effective?
Okay, so I'm going to answer that question in a different way. Because if I call it mind control, the listeners are going to think that this is abnormal or something that might only occur in a relationship with a predator. And I'm going to suggest that mind control occurs in every relationship. That's part of being human. That we get, and that goes back to what I was saying about the importance of validation. The important people in our lives validate our sense of reality. And so and I think every religion stresses this, by the way. I was listening to a podcast this morning from a religious teacher, and that person was saying, you will become like the people you spend the most time with. And that fact about her story really struck me, that from the beginning of the relationship, the Susanna that was started to morph under the influence of this very pathological person. And she began to take on his sickness in some ways. I think we could view him as sick. And it's this kind of sickness, it's a contagious disease, the psychological, not COVID-19, but the psychological, I guess it's the psychological pandemic of our time is relationship sickness from psychopathic individuals. And they make you mentally sick. And similarly, like the other thing that the podcast from the religious teacher was saying, listen, if I surround myself with really solid, saintly people that are going somewhere, that have a positive outlook, that have meaning in their lives, and believe in, and have good values and treat people well, then I'm going to become a more healthy person. So I agree that she was subjected to mind control, and I do agree that it also has to do with the fact that this is the way a psychopathic individual, that's what they do in the relationship, because the relationship is about them controlling their target. But also listeners should be aware that this is going to occur in any relationship. That she took on his values, and she, I think, even used the term worldview at some point in the end. She took on his worldview. That's what you do. You take on the worldview of the people you spend time with. And this is a great lesson for all of us. Find solid people to spend your time with and be sure of them.
Okay, so how does finally learning the truth and learning that the perpetrator was likely disordered help a survivor to overcome the trauma?
Oh, I believe this is the most important thing we can do for survivors. And that's why, Donna, I think your mission and what you've dedicated your life to is so important. Because let's just look at the opposite. Let's just say that she comes to the conclusion that Luke is just like any other guy, right? So in response to that, she can form two very dysfunctional beliefs. One is that she deserved this, and it was her fault, because if he's normal and wonderful and things went wrong, then maybe it's her fault. The other thing is, if she leaves this relationship believing that all men are like Luke, then she won't be able to have a healthy relationship later on. So knowing that Luke is sick, or however you want to put it, I guess some psychologists don't like the idea of sickness, because this is actually an adaptation, that Luke survives this way, and probably the vampire analogy is a good analogy, but that he's aberrant, that he doesn't represent all men, or could be a woman. She wouldn't represent all women either. That helps her to say, okay, I can still have hope to have this love. Like the other thing of her story that was so inspiring, she's capable of such love. Mm-hmm. That's a gift. Not everybody's capable of loving another person that much. If she finds a person that's worthy of her love, then she's going to have a great life with that person. And so seeing him as disordered or sick helps her to go forward. But I just want to say this to the listeners. Now, I know in the third one, you started talking about psychopathy. And if the listeners hear about the prevalence of psychopathy, it's like 1% of the population or something like that. The problem is that those statistics are not helpful for what we're talking about. What we're talking about, psychopathic traits that impact relationships to this degree, I believe are present in about 15% of young adults. So that means that, you have a 1 in 6 chance of finding one of these creatures. No, I shouldn't dehumanize them, but finding one of these people. And so all the more to be very careful about who you spend your time with, who you make love to, who you attach to, because this could be the outcome, 1 in 6 times.
Wow. So, is there anything else that you want to address as far as what happened to her before we start talking about recovery?
There's always hindsight being 20/20, right? She knew she was vulnerable getting into this. And I do think that the fact that she initially didn't really like him caused some of the cognitive dissonance that may have made her love him all the more, in addition to the trauma bond. So I guess the other lesson for the listener is be careful of the friends with benefits situation. That could, maybe if you're putting somebody into a friends with benefit classification, that might tell you that this is somebody you don't really think is a long-term partner prospect. And if you end up spending too much time with them, you may develop a bond with them that you didn't intend. And this could be the outcome. Maybe that puts too much responsibility on the survivor. But, if we're looking for lessons from this story, I think that could be one of the lessons we take away.
I think that's really valuable. I'm Donna Anderson, and this is True Love Fraud Stories. I hope you enjoyed the first part of my interview with Dr. Liane Leedom. In the next episode, Dr. Leedom will explain the 4 behavioral systems that enable us, as humans, to have relationships with other people. One of them is the affiliation system. To learn more about Dr. Leedom's work, visit her page on Researchgate. Or, if you have specific questions, send her an email. For links and other resources, please visit the page about this episode on podcasts.lovefraud.com. True Love Fraud Stories is produced by lovefraud.com. I'm the author of lovefraud.com. Engineering is by Terry Kelly. To learn how to recognize and recover from everyday sociopaths, visit lovefraud.com. And for more information about this story, other great stories, or if you'd like to share your story, visit podcasts.lovefraud.com.